The Lord be with you. I've changed the reading again this morning, and I've actually created a kind of a collage of writings from St. Luke. I've taken 4 passages from his Gospel and 1 passage from his Acts of Apostles, because they're all dealing with the same subject matter, which is the formation of community and mission. And so I've stitched them together in this morning's reading. One of those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to them, and he chose 12 of them, whom he called apostles. When he had called the 12 together, he gave them power and authority to drive out demons and to cure diseases. And he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. So they set out and went from village to village, proclaiming the good news and healing people everywhere. After that, the Lord appointed 72 others and sent them 2 by 2 ahead of him to every town and place where he was about to go himself. He told them, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. Go, I am sending you out like lambs among wolves." In those days, we now jump to the Acts of the Apostles and the young church. Jesus is gone at this stage, and the young church is trying to find its way. In those days, when the number of disciples was increasing, the Hellenistic Jews complained against the Hebraic Jews because their widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. So the 12 gathered all the disciples together and said, "It would not be right for us to neglect the ministry of the Word of God in order to wait on tables. Brothers and sisters, choose 7 from among you who are known to be full of the Spirit and wisdom. We will turn this responsibility over to them, and we will give our attention to prayer and the ministry of the Word." So the community chose 7 whom they presented to the apostles. The apostles prayed and laid their hands upon them. A gospel inspired by God. It's one of the best feelings of all when you've got a piece of news that nobody else has, and you get to be the first, to tell a group of people. Yeah? And I'm not talking about gossip here. I'm not talking about bad news. I'm talking about when you've got some really good news that nobody else has, and you're the first person to break it to a group or a community. It's a great, great, great feeling. And particularly if it's really good news and it's totally new stuff, then you feel really, really good about being the one to get the chance, to give this to a group. And I've had that privilege as a young man in my late 20s in a very remote part of East Africa, getting to be the first person to tell a community the story of Jesus. It's an extraordinary sensation to be able to go into a total community who've never heard of this guy in their entire lives, and to be the first person to tell this story, to tell this great story, which brings a new theology, a new cosmology, a new total relationship with God. It's a great, great feeling. And then to watch what happens to a community. So there's a pre-existing community, it's got its own norms, its own established system of doing things, and then watch how they cross-fertilize this, they integrate this with their own wisdom, because it's not a replacement for the old wisdom, it's to be integrated into the old. It's to be cross-fertilization of wisdom traditions. But to watch what happens to a culture as they take in a brand new story that they've never heard before and rework their own culture, in the light of this new story. Now, there are several of us here who got that privilege on 2 other occasions in the last 20 years. There are people here in this group who got to create a brand new story on 2 different occasions. Firstly, in 1995, when we created the Thomas Merton Centre. So having broken away in some senses from the Catholic Church in the diocese and come in with a whole new story and a whole new way of empowering ourselves and each other, empowering everybody in the community, not just the hierarchical top layer of it. It was a great experience. The first piece of it lasted about 2 years, and then, as you know, it fragmented. But then 17 years ago, we got to do it for a second time. as a group of people. And a lot of you here are part of that movement as well. 17 years ago, we get to create a totally different story, and we call it Companions on the Journey. And again, it was a way of re-empowering everybody into positions of leadership, and the realization that the message of God is something that energizes every single one of us, and we all exercise leadership in some fashions. And we tell a very different story of our relationship to each other, our relationship to the planet, and our relationship to God. So we've had that experience, many of us here, and at least 2 occasions in the last 20 years. So I want to address that notion of community today, because we have 2 very important meetings coming up, one this morning after Mass and one in 2 weeks' time. And so I'm going to make just 4 main points this morning. The first one, I want to talk about the notion of the preconception contract. And then secondly, I want to talk about stages of community building. And then thirdly, I'm going to talk about the history and the future of ministry. And then fourthly, I'm going to just offer a few reflections on what I consider guidelines for choosing and being leaders in any community. So there are the 4 points I mentioned this morning. So the first point is this notion of the preconception contract. You've heard me speak to this many times. I am totally convinced that, since I believe in reincarnation, that groups of souls migrate from lifetime to lifetime with each other. They have a contract with each other to play significant roles in each other's lives. The relationships will change, the roles will change, genders will change, circumstances will change, but there are groups of souls committed to helping each other in the process of moving towards enlightenment. And I call that a preconception contract. Now, I believe that the contract exists at many, many, many different levels in a kind of a fractal fashion. All the ways from, you have a special soul contract with your soul mate. And this is somebody, whom you will visit with from incarnation to incarnation, and there's going to be a special bond between you. Now, in my language, the word we use for that is actually anamachara. And anamachara has a wider sense than the English equivalent. When we think of soulmate, we think of romantic partners. In my language, it doesn't mean that. An anamachara is a special soul connection, and it can be between a mother and child, it can be between a husband and wife, it can be between siblings, it can be between best friends. So it doesn't necessarily mean a romantic attachment. It can be any friendship which is really, really close and special in your life. So that's kind of the first level of a preconception contract, where there's one special person, whom you're going to relate to in a particular fashion in a lifetime. Then you extend that out, and you have a contract with your family, a preconception contract with your family. You've called them, and they've called you into a particular kind of relationship in this particular incarnation. You've got a contract with your tribe or your nation. You've got a contract with the human species. You've got a contract with all sentient beings. You've got a contract with all manifestations in all dimensions of all universes, parallel or otherwise. So everything that exists, every manifestation from Source, is in a contract with all other manifestations of Source. So there's various levels to this contract that we step ourselves through. And the purpose of the contract is that we're here on a mission. Every individual is on a mission. Every community is on a mission. And so there are missions and there's submission. Now, we think of submission as kind of a craven, breastbeating, I'm not worthy, tell me what to do. That is not the meaning of a submission. Submission means a mission that dovetails with a greater mission. And so the individual mission is a submission to the mission of a community. Or the mission of a community is a submission to the mission of our species. Or the mission of the species is a submission to the mission of all sentient beings. And so in that sense, all of us are involved, in submissions. It doesn't make us any less important. It just means that we have to dovetail our personal activities, our social activities, our global activities with God's plan. And God's plan basically is it is a single safari from God's womb to God's heart. And it takes eons and eons and eons for that trajectory, with many diversions in between. But basically, that is the journey. That is the mission. That's the purpose. All missions, individual missions, societal missions, global missions, are sub-missions to that mission. We have to tailor our activities to that. So that's what it looks like to be in a preconception contract, that we're involved in that sense. And it involves waking myself up. It involves helping to wake others up. And it involves us helping to wake all others up. So it's always about awakening. And the awakening has to start with the individual self. I can only help to wake somebody else up if I'm awake myself. In case of an emergency, oxygen mask will drop from the ceiling. Do not attempt to help anybody else until you put on your own mask. If you're not awake, you're only leading other people astray. It's the blind leading the blind. And so our first function is to wake ourselves up, and then to help the others wake up, and then finally to wake up the entire planet and to move it into Christ consciousness. So that's the contract we all signed up for. That's the preconception contract as individuals and as communities and as a planet Earth. So that's my first point then, the preconception contract. Secondly, then I want to look at the stages of community building. There are always 4 stages, it seems to me, in relationships, no matter what the relationship is. So I'll give you just 3 examples. One from kind of spiritual literature, one from marriage literature, and one from community literature. So for instance, in the spiritual life, all the great mystics tell us that the spiritual journey goes through 4 very distinct phases. The first stage is you encounter a God or a spiritual system and you fall head over heels in love with it. You say, oh my God, I didn't realize there was anything as good as this out there. So you're totally enamored of this new system or this new spirituality. You're head over heels in love with it. That's stage 1. Stage 2 is you now commit yourself completely to the practices that will bring you into alignment with that new realization. So maybe it's meditation, or it's going to church, or it's the rosary, or it's pilgrimage, whatever it is. You come into the practices that help to align you with this new realization. That's stage 2. Stage 3 always comes, and in the literature is called the dark night of the soul. So now you've been doing your practices for 3 or 4 years and it feels really, really, really good. You're radiating light and you're radiating love. And then at some stage, the whole system just goes cold. You're doing all the same things you were doing. You're meditating as much as you were meditating. You're praying as much as you were praying. And it's like wormwood. It's like sawdust in your mouth. And it's called the dark night of the soul. And the function of it is to make sure that you're not just on the journey for egoic reasons. It's very, very easy to be infatuated with God when you feel really, really good as a result. And so the ego is always ready to hijack any enterprising, project. Anything that's looking good, the ego will run around in front of it and pretend to lead it, just like our politicians do. If you've got any good idea, politician will get in front of it and pretend he started it. The ego does the very, very same thing. If it's looking good, the ego wants to get around in front of it and be in charge. And so God says at some stage, okay, what if it didn't feel that good? What if you weren't, feeling on top of the world? What if it was a drudge? Would you still stay faithful to the practice? And the dark night of the soul can go on anywhere from months to years. Mother Teresa's biography suggests that the second half of her life was spent in the dark night of the soul. And still she showed up every single morning to her prayer, to her meditation, to her mass, to going out to pick up little children off the streets of Calcutta, even though she was in this totally desiccated, dried, dark space. But she remained totally committed. That's stage 3 of the spiritual journey. And stage 4 then, for most people, there's either a breakdown or there's a breakthrough. As a result of the dark night of the soul, I either lose my faith or I stay with the process and I break through into unity consciousness. And then I realize there is only God. It's not about me serving God. It's not about me feeling good. It's only about God being, manifesting in her creation. And that's the unitive stage. That's stage 4. The very same thing happens in marriages, in my experience as a psychologist. The first stage is you find somebody and you fall head over heels in love with them. You're it's like infatuation. The sun and the moon and the stars shine out of my beloved. And then the second stage is intimacy. There's the practice of sharing everything together. You share your resources, your body, your mind, your heart, your dreams, your fears, your finances. Everything is shared. There always comes a stage 3 in a marriage. And it's called in the literature disillusionment. And it sounds like it's a bad thing, but actually disillusionment is really a good thing. Disillusionment means the shattering of the illusion. Because the truth is the first 2 stages were an illusion. I wasn't really in love with you. I was in love with the fantasized, romanticized, idealized version of whom I wanted you to be. And now I see that you've got flaws just like me, and now the disillusionment starts. And stage 4 then is, this is the time when we either, we do our work, we learn how to communicate better, how to compromise a little bit more, how to take self out of the equation so that it's not 2 egos bashing each other, but 2 souls dancing together. And then you break through into stage 4. Is it either a breakdown and a divorce, or a breakthrough and there's a real deep, deep loving marriage. So we see it in personal relationships. And you see it in the evolution of communities as well. And so, the first stage is you either encounter a community or you help create a community. and it's fantastic, it's exciting, it's really, really great. I never realized there could be this kind of community available to me, or that I could help, create this kind of community. That's always stage one. Stage two then is a practice where we throw ourselves completely into it, and there's nothing we won't do for our community. So there's the practice and the commitment and the dedication to moving the process along. But stage three always comes. And stage three is because we're individual egos, there's always going to be personality clashes. And there's always going to be some level of projection going on, where we project our light onto somebody and we make heroes of them, or we project our shadow onto somebody and we make villains out of them. And so the dysfunction is always going to become a stage three of any community's enterprise. And again, there's going to be one of two outcomes. There's going to be a breakdown, or there's going to be a breakthrough. The community will take itself to the next level, or it'll totally, fall asunder. So the key to this piece is the realization that a symptom is a creative process about to happen. A symptom is always a creative process about to happen. If it's seen as a disease and the end, it will become that. If it's seen as an opportunity to transcend and to grow, it becomes that as well. And it's true of all communities. You go way, way back, the end of today's reading, it was taken from the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 6. And it's the story of the young community shortly after Jesus has gone. And already there's a division there. They've already gone through the infatuation stage and the kind of the intimacy stage, and they're now reading some kind of disillusionment. And there's a big complaint going on that in the daily distribution of food to the widows and orphans, the children of the Hellenistic Jews are being neglected, while the children of the Hebraic Jews are being fed. Now, the difference is this. A lot of Jews at the time of Jesus lived in a diaspora situation. They didn't live in the land of Israel. They were scattered throughout the Roman Empire. And the official language of the Roman Empire was not Latin, it was Greek. The language of the literati, was Greek. So a lot of people who lived in the Roman Empire were Greek-speaking, even if they didn't live in Greece. And so many of the Jews who lived in diaspora, their language was Greek. So they're called Hellenistic Jews. And then there are the Jews who lived in the land of Israel, and they're speaking a different language. It says Hebraic. They weren't speaking Hebrew, they were speaking Aramaic. Hebrew was the language of liturgy. Aramaic was the language of ordinary discourse. So you got two groups now, and one group is complaining, our widows and orphans are being totally neglected. The guys who are giving out the food are favoring the Aramaic-speaking Jewish widows and orphans, and we're being neglected. So already there's a division. And so the decision today was they were going to create a new ministry in order to address this need. And the new ministry was called the diaconate. And I'll talk about that a little later on. So already you have a division happening there. A little bit later, there's a phrase at the very, very end, shortly after this, I didn't read it today, and it sneaks in, and the vast bulk of Christians do not realize this. And it says very simply, many of the priests joined the young movement. And it slips by us, slips over our heads, we don't realize it. Many of the priests actually joined the young Jesus movement. Now that was a good thing and a bad thing. So you imagine, that's great. Finally, the spiritual leaders are getting the message, and they're realizing that Jesus is the Messiah. They did that, but there was a huge price for it. And the price was this. They started to drag the new movement back into patriarchy and back into legalism and back into respectability, because that's what priests tend to do. They're always part of the status quo. So they tend to want to drag us back into patriarchal thinking, into legalistic thinking, and into respectability. So how, for instance, who's going to take seriously any spiritual movement in which you have women leaders? Get a grip on yourselves, guys. What are you thinking about? Yeah? And so we got that's out. We've got to get rid of that kind of thinking. We want to be respectable and accepted in some way. We've got to get rid of those kind of elements. So they're dragging it back. If you want respectability, you want to be taken seriously, there's a whole bunch of changes. So let's go back to where we were. Legalism, patriarchy, and respectability. So there's a huge price for it. So you got that division, which has a huge impact on the evolution of the young church. We see it in our own time. We see it when you live in this valley. You see any, startup and the excitement of a startup. It goes through the same 4 stages. There's a group of people get together in a garage, Wozniak and Jobs in a garage someplace, and they start this little thing called Apple, and it builds and builds, and the excitement, and they add members to it, and people are working 20 hours a day because they love it and they want to do it, and it becomes hugely successful. And then at some stage they decide they need respectability. They want to bring in a real CEO who knows business and how to grow something, and then they want to go, IPO or whatever, and the whole thing falls asunder. The whole atmosphere, within the movement is totally very different. So we see the very same thing happening in startups in this valley. It's stage 3 of any organization. And finally it kind of rectifies itself, and you bring jobs back, to resurrect it or whatever you do. But we see evidence of this, in all facets of life. That's the second point I want to make. The third point then I want to look at the history and the future of ministry. I've said to you many times that ministry is not something that's conferred hierarchically by the guys on the top upon some guys halfway down the scheme. That's not ministry. Ministry has 4 components. There's a need in the community. There's somebody who volunteers to meet that need. To meet that need. The person either has the abilities or is given the training. And then they're commissioned by the community or by delegates of the community to act in that capacity on behalf of the community. So there's 4 stages. There's a need in the community, whatever the need is, doesn't matter what the need is. There's a volunteer, says, I'll do it. There's a training given, or the person has already the abilities, and then the community, or delegates of the community, say, okay, we're going to commission you to do this. And that was the very end of today's story, where the apostle says, we don't have time to be serving food to everybody. Our job is to pray and to speak the word of God. We're preachers, basically. We don't have the ability to be social workers as well. So we're going to create a brand new ministry in a sense. So here's the need. People need to be fed. There are people in the community who are willing and able to do this kind of thing. So now we're going to pray and commission them to do that. So you got the 4 stages. There's the need, the volunteer, the ability or the training, and then the commissioning by the group to act in that capacity in their stead. So that's what ministry consists of. And the early church, responded to all, as emerging needs happen. When a community begins to grow, new needs begin to emerge, and then you need to begin to address those needs. So in the early church, there were basically 2 kinds of needs that started to emerge. There were liturgical needs, and there were social needs. And so they created a whole bunch of ministries in each of these 2 categories. So liturgically, there was a ministry created called the porter. And the porter was the guy in charge of the door. And you think, somebody's going to open the door? Big deal, that's a liturgical exercise. You have to realize that this was a persecuted movement. And they were conducting their liturgies in secret, in individual homes. So every time a knock came on the door, you had no idea whether it was a spy or a Roman soldier, and the whole group was going to be arrested and killed. And so there was a guy whose function was literally to watch the door and make sure that whoever was coming was a friend, not somebody who was going to betray the movement. So it was a really important ministry. The second ministry they created was called the lector, which is what Lawrence and Ria did for us today. And so not everybody at that time was able to read. Being able to read, was a real gift. Not everybody could read. And so when the young churches began to share letters and to write letters backwards and forth to each other, somebody needed to read that to the community. So there was a whole ministry set up. Okay, the need is, we need somebody to read these letters. Any volunteers? Yeah, I went to school. Okay, brilliant. Okay, here's we just got from Thessalonica. What does it say? And so another ministry is created called the lector. A third ministry that's created is called the acolyte. And the acolyte is the person who now knows the ritual fairly well, and can move the community through the stages, stand up now, kneel down now, whatever, blow out the candles now, whatever it is. So the acolyte was the person who knew the ritual and could help move the group through it. The priest was the person who presided over the liturgy, the Eucharist particularly, and then the bishop was he was both a liturgist and an administrator. That was their functions. So as needs arose in the community, ministries were created to fulfill those needs. The second category were social needs. And today you heard the first group. There's a need to feed the widows and the orphans. So you're reaching out to social justice. Who's going to do that? So there's a need, there's volunteers, the apostles accept them, they pray over them, and they commission them to act in that capacity on their stead. And then the final one was exorcist. Exorcists, we think about casting out demons. But the reason for that is, as I said a few Sundays ago, the model of illness at the time of Jesus was that all illnesses are caused by demons. So whether it's a psychological illness, a physical illness, or a spiritual illness, the belief system was the etiology of all illness is demonic possession of some kind or other. And so the way to treat all illnesses was some kind of exorcism. So when we look at exorcism now, it was really a healing ministry, more so than casting out demons, strictly speaking. And so here was a need in the community. There were sick people in the community, psychologically sick, emotionally sick, physically ill, spiritually, whatever. And there's a whole group of people set up, and your function is to heal that group. So you see in the early church, they're responding to real needs, emerging needs in the community by creating appropriate ministries. And you see that happening in Europe in the Middle Ages. And again, it was the church, in fairness, that took the leadership here, particularly monasteries. Agriculture was really developed by and spread by the monastic communities. The agriculture of Europe was something that was brought to perfection in the monasteries. They were totally self-sufficient, and then they taught people outside, how to do the very same thing. So agriculture was a ministry. People needed food to be able to grow their own food, and the monks led the way in teaching them how to do that. They were the founders of great universities of Europe. So the great scholarship of Europe, they kept learning alive during the Dark Ages, and then they subsequently built the great universities, Paris and Rome and whatever. And this was a response to the need for learning in the community. So the monks responded to that by creating these universities. Later on in European history, you got groups of nuns particularly, and brothers in some instances, responding to the educational needs of just ordinary people. So ordinary little kids. So they set up the whole system of primary schools and secondary schools. It was the nuns particularly that took responsibility for looking at, in the 1800s, little urchins, totally uneducated and with no prospects, and taking them in and starting a school system to address those needs. And the same thing, it was the nuns basically who set up the hospital systems. The realization that illness was rampant, in Europe, and some kind of a concerted, organized effort to address this need, and they set up the whole medical system and the whole hospital system. So again and again and again, you see that there's a need arises. Volunteers say, "I'll try that." I'm given the training, and then I'm commissioned to act in that capacity, and I go out and I serve the need of the community. So projecting into the future, what are the ministries going to look like? I would suggest that the two most important ministries that we're on the verge of, identifying and creating, and in my opinion, they are much more important even than medicine, even than agriculture, even than education, and even liturgical. And the two ministries I would identify are ecology and the peace movement. That is where our world needs healing right now. It is people who will step up to the plate. Our world is being destroyed, literally polluted to extinction. And there are people who are beginning at this stage to step up, and there's movements all over saying, I'll do something about this. And they're either getting the training, or they have the abilities, and the rest of us have to say to them, go for it, guys, do this on our behalf. And people who are trying to create peace movements, realizing that we can't continue this ridiculous military-industrial complex of just destroying our world. And there are people stepping up and say, I will attempt to do something about this. And there you have the training or the ability, and we sort of go for it, guys. In my opinion, they're the two most important ministries of the future. Much more important than the other stuff we're doing. Which is not to say we can neglect to do what we're doing. We need to do it and add these kinds of things to it. So that's where ministry is headed, as far as I'm concerned. And then the final reflection I want to give is, I just want to give a few, off the top of my head, what I would consider guidelines for choosing and being leaders in any organization or in any community. And the first one I would say is quoting the famous Tao Te Ching, which is a beautiful wisdom document from Lao Tzu, who flourished about the year 600 BC. And speaking of leadership, he said very powerfully one time, he said, of the great leader, people will say, we did it ourselves. Of the truly great leader, people will say, we did it ourselves. So leadership is the ability to inspire a community in some ways. It's not the ability to stand out and you can take credit for everything that's happening in the community. Now, I kind of differentiate two periods. In times of crisis, visible, centralized leadership is important in times of crisis. For the rest of the time, invisible, decentralized leadership is the ideal. And that's true whether you're in industry, in politics, in a community like ourselves. So I would hold that as one precept of, choosing and being a leader. The next two I would see as complementary pieces. So I'm going to say what they are and then flesh them out a little bit. So they're totally complementary. The next two are totally complementary. The first one is that it's important to not change a winning team. If something is working, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's one piece. The other piece is you need to rotate leadership so that everybody in the community with the abilities, gets an opportunity to exercise leadership themselves. So they're the two complementary pieces. So let me expand on that a little bit. The first one is this. If a leader or a group of leaders are doing a really great job in a community, and it is very unlikely that the proposed substitutes, are either have the time, the ability, the willingness, or the commitment to do something approximating that level of leadership, then we shouldn't just change for the sake of changing. So don't change a winning team just for the sake of changing a winning team. If there aren't leaders, commensurate, and having those capabilities, willingness, abilities, and dedication to it. But the other piece is this: all things being relatively equal. All things being relatively equal, it is very important that we rotate leadership so that everybody, with the abilities, the commitment, the dedication, the talent, and the time, gets an opportunity to exercise these kinds of gifts. So these are the two complementary pieces. Now, at every stage of a community's development, we need to look at these two, and they're going to be weighted differently at different times. At times of crisis, as I say, visible, centralized leadership is very important. In normal times, the invisible, decentralized kind of leadership is very important. So that's second and third principle. A third principle I would say is this. There's a rule in organizations called the 20-80 rule, and it's very, very accurate. In any organization and in any community, 20% of the people will do 80% of the work. And whether that's a spiritual community, or it's Apple, IBM, or politics, or whatever, 20% of the people will do 80% of the work. That's a fact. That's how it shakes down always. And so to realize that there are a lot of people who will be part of a community and they'll go along, but they won't take any kind of leadership roles or do much of the work. 20% of those will show up and keep doing the work. That's a fact of life. Now, it's been my experience that volunteers, if you make an announcement to say, next Sunday we need a volunteer to do cleanup, everybody, is thinking, there's 60 of us in the church, somebody else will do it. It's like the scene of an accident. The more people see an accident happening, the less likely somebody's actually going to help. That's true, absolutely true. You're in a little village on your own, and there's a car crash at the intersection, you're going to go straight over and help. There's 100 people around watching the accident, chances are nobody's going to go. Okay, if you think, somebody else saw it before me, I'm out of here. So the more people actually that witness it, the less opportunity, the less likelihood is that somebody will actually intervene. Now, so what I found out over the years is that if you make a general appeal for a volunteer for something, nobody will show up. And so very often you're going to say, Marge, we really need somebody to clean up next Sunday. Any chance you could do it? And much more likely get a yes. Now, the problem about this is it then begins to look like cronyism, because you begin to pick the people who always say yes, and you're not going to pick people who constantly say no. So it looks like, to an outsider, there's cronyism happening there. How come, Marge is always the one, in a leadership position? And so that's another factor here. Generic appeals for volunteers don't work. There needs to be some kind of individual approach in order for it to work. But then you suffer the possibility of being regarded as, exercising cronyism. And the other thing I want to say about volunteers is this, that most work in a community, and it's true of our community as well, most work in a community is done by people who are not in leadership positions. They're taking responsibility for stuff, and they're doing it, and nobody even knows who they are that's doing it. And so you don't have to be in an elected position or an appointed position in order to exercise significant leadership in a group. There's lots of different ways of it. So the final rule is this, and I call it for myself, it is the golden rule of COJ, in my experience. It was a rule we formulated at the very, very beginning, and I called it the golden rule of COJ. And it was this: you get an idea, you're in charge of making it happen. Somebody comes up with an idea which is meeting some need in the community, you're in charge of it. And we've done that again and again and again. So it's not, I have an idea, who's going to do it? So I have an idea, Jerry, can you do this? No, I have the idea, I'm in charge of implementing the idea. Now, Rita comes up with an idea, she's in charge of making it happen. And that has been the rule, I think, that has really kept this community really, really vibrant. It is that when you identify a need in a group, you're in charge of making it happen.